Okay, people, so this is a meeting of the Royal Society of South Africa, and it's co-hosted with the Academy of Science of South Africa. So we have some general matters that we have to deal with before we actually begin the actual lecture. So the first thing I have to do is welcome the new members of the society. And I should just remind you all that new members are basically welcomed. There's no special restrictions. All you have to be is curious about the world of science, and of course you pay a very small subscription fee. The new members that we are welcoming here today are Dr. Thevan Manikam of Umgani Water, Pietermaritzburg, and Dr. Eshwal Ntlandla of the University of Limpopo, and we have a Miss Catherine Ellis Usher of the University of Stellenbosch. So those are the three new members. Welcome to the three of you. And if any of you would like to join the Royal Society, there are membership forms available on the website. So I know that you're all here eagerly waiting to listen to Professor William Bond talk to us about Beyond the Forest's Edge, Understanding Open Ecosystems. And I'm sure you all know the wonderful reputation that William Bond has, and this has brought you all to this talk today. So William Bond holds a rare honor. He is a fellow of both the Royal Society of London and the Royal Society of South Africa. He is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at UCT, and William is fascinated by the processes influencing vegetation change over time. He received his BSc Honours at the University of Exeter and his Master's degree at UCT. His PhD is from the University of California, and I know that, like me, many of you know that William has a fantastic H-index. He has more than 30,000 citations of his work, and he is listed as a highly cited researcher. His recently published book called Open Ecosystems, Ecology and Evolution Beyond the Forest Edge was published by Oxford University Press, and I'm sure that William will tell us more about this. William, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad that you've been able to do this talk for us. So thank you and welcome.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen. I don't know quite how that'll work.
It hasn't worked yet, but maybe it's taking some time.
It says when I try to share a screen, the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Carolyn, have you done anything there?
Should be fine now.
You have to unmute.
It should be fine now.
All right, I'll try again. Aha. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks very much for attending. So I'm not quite sure how to minimize this stuff. There we go. So here's a satellite image of the world. And my talk is dealing with the major vegetation patterns of the world. We call them biomes, and why they exist where they do, and what factors determine where they exist. And we're interested in this kind of problem because of global change. The vegetation is the interface between us and space. And so changes in that vegetation influence the planetary system. So the standard argument, the standard idea has been that climate determines world vegetation patterns. And this has been so for at least 200 years. But does it? I mean, really, climate certainly correlates with world vegetation patterns. And if you stuff enough climate variables in, you can get it to correlate with just about anything. But does it determine world vegetation? And that's a hypothesis. So it's built on the idea that the pattern of world vegetation is correlated with climate. The processes underlying the patterns are thought to be the physiological fit to climate. So drought-tolerant plants growing in arid areas, tall forest trees where it's wet and warm. And a second important hypothesis, which is that the succession of species, the dynamic aspect, is driven by soil development and competition for light. So here's that idea. It's after some disturbance that's removed a forest or that's created brand new land, early succession of species prepare the soil. They grow there in high sunlight. They in turn are replaced by usually taller species that develop in the soil that's created by this one, and then successively taller, more shade-tolerant species replace each other until finally you reach a point where tall trees and those that are tolerant of their shade exist in a continuous system. So why should trees dominate the world? Well, I think this slide makes it pretty obvious that competition for light is highly asymmetric. The tallest plants that cast the most shade capture light, and any smaller plant has to survive on what's left over. And so the most shade-tolerant juveniles will eventually begin to dominate and take over a site. Anusha, please just tell me if my voice is too soft or anything like that. So what are the predictions from this climate? Is it right?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. The predictions are straightforward. Where it's warm enough and wet enough, we would expect to find closed forests, warm enough and wet enough for tree growth. Where it's too cold or too dry for trees, you expect non-forest. Ghastly word, but we don't have a general term like forest for non-forest. Where there aren't any trees, where there aren't any forests, we can also point to, well, perhaps the soils are hostile for tree growth. They're too shallow for the roots or too waterlogged, or they represent that successional problem that the forests have been disturbed. And so what we're looking at is the early stages post-disturbance before trees have been able to colonize. So here's an environment in the desert in Namibia, and we don't expect forests. It's too dry for tree growth. This is an image of New Zealand, and you can see the tree line there, this extraordinary tree line, which I first encountered in this startling form in New Zealand. And above that tree line, it's too cold for tree growth. Just why trees don't grow there, it remains a bit of a puzzle. But given that it's warm enough, then the problem is moisture. So along a rainfall gradient, in the arid areas, very little tree growth, and then as the moisture increases, tree growth and tree biomass increases massively. And this outlier here is where it's too cold. So cold is beginning to limit tree growth. This is a gradient in North America, and it's a very common perception in the Northern Hemisphere that this is the way things should work. As rainfall increases, and if it's warm enough, you'll get more and more trees forming a closed forest. But that's not how it works everywhere. And this is how it looks in Famos. This is in the Kogelberg. It's the highest rainfall in South Africa, amongst the highest rainfall. And the vegetation hardly reaches waist height. And biomass hardly responds to rainfall. It's just ridiculously low. But if you look hard enough, you will find in these landscapes patches of forest. There's one underneath this arrow here. And that's what it looks like inside. Completely different. It's a small forest, deep shade, and there's not a single famous plant growing within that shade. Here's another example behind Swellendam, where the forest, and in the foreground you can see the proteas, dead proteas from Famos, growing in the same climate, on the same geology, and effectively the same soils. So we have a conundrum. And if you put the data together, starting with succulent karoo, and going into thicket, Eastern Cape thicket, and then you look at Afro-montane forest, we see that the potential for tree growth is very high. And this is what foresters have exploited. These are pine plantations and eucalypt plantations. And there's plenty of possibility for tree growth, but Famos doesn't use it. So now we're left with, it's warm enough and wet enough for tree growth. It's the soils, although people consider them hostile, we do find Famos growing perfectly well, forest growing perfectly well on the same geologies as Famos grows on. So we're left with the final hypothesis that the non-forest, the Famos, has been disturbed and is early successional. Really? Is Famos an early successional seral stage to forest? Well, you might consider that. If you look at this landscape, it's all been burnt except for the forest. So it has undergone a disturbance. That's certainly true. But is that disturbance going to lead to succession towards forest, or is it a natural component of the Famos? It's very unlikely that Famos is early successional. You'd expect it, early successional vegetation, to be short-lived, temporary. But if that's the case, you wouldn't really expect many species in it. And Famos is the most diverse temperate flora in the world. Here's just a sample of proteas. And 97% of these species occur nowhere else except in Famos in the Western Cape. This is not an early successional environment. Here you're looking at Myrmetes stokoi. This is about half the global population. The total world population can probably fit inside a tennis court. It's an extremely rare habitat endemic. This is certainly an ancient species belonging to an ancient lineage and an ancient vegetation type, and is not early successional at all. You wouldn't be able to produce species like this with tiny distribution ranges in habitats that are very ephemeral. So what we have here is an actual biomass that's low and a potential biomass reached in some instances. And the difference between this potential and the actual is not due to climate, nor soils, nor is it due to deforestation, whether by people or some natural disturbance. So we sort of run out of standard explanations for these forest, non-forest mosaics, and we need some new explanations. And here I think you got to go back to this successional idea. It's implicit, people have thrown stones at it, but this is the basic idea running through popular ideas and indeed in ecology. So A goes to B goes to C. A creates an environment which is unsuitable for itself, but where it makes it easy for the next species in the line to take over. And B does the same for C. Is this correct? Have plants really evolved to reduce their own offspring chances of survival? It'd be a very happy world, but it's extraordinarily unlikely in terms of what we know about evolution and Darwin's mechanism. But what if the little guys could prevent the big guys from coming in? What if they could create some kind of way of maintaining themselves so that they, in turn, just like the climax species, create their own little community by excluding the possibilities of these taller trees replacing them? And this is where we have a new concept, alternative stable states. I'm calling them alternative biome states in this talk. And what we end up with is a very unstable intermediate state, which tends either to move towards closed forest or to move in the opposite direction to short species that are able to exclude the tall trees. And the short ones are typically grasslands or shrublands. The tall ones we call closed forest. So open vegetation and closed forests are alternative biome states. They have the same physical starting conditions, but the biological assemblages diverge strongly, and each assemblage creates the environmental conditions that perpetuate it, that make it ideal for that assemblage. So here's an example. This is just after a fire, literally hours after an intense burn, and this is thick ash from fires ripping through Famos. They stopped at this forest margin, and you can see green matter just a meter or two inside there. So we have flammable Famos and fire-resistant and fire-intolerant forest. Literally, you can step over that with 1 or 2 steps. And these are profoundly different systems. The plant traits have diverged in this fire-resistant forest versus the flammable Famos open ecosystem. They diverge in their light response, shade tolerant, shade hating, in their growth form, trees, shrubs, in their leaf traits, large leaves, small leaves, in their flammability, the nature of their architectures, in their fruit and seed size, in their below ground rooting strategies, and in their nutrient acquisition. These differences are so profound that it is easier for a plant, a species, or a lineage to cross oceans rather than to cross this ecological divide. And we see that in the development of quite different evolutionary lineages in the Famos, with families such as these, versus the Famos clades, Proteaceae, Resinaceae, Ericaceae, the cave clades, versus the forest clades. Absolutely remarkable divergence based on vicariant ecology and not vicariant geography. So it's interesting then to ask, well, where is there a climate signal where you might find these strikingly different alternative stable biome states? And way back in the 1970s, a brilliant plant ecologist, Whitaker, tried to segregate the major biomes of the world on a temperature and a precipitation axis. And he was able to say, well, tropical rainforests in general are above 250 centimeters of rain, 2,500 millimeters, and warmer than an annual temperature of 20 degrees. These are very crude ordinations of biomes, but they're not bad. Where his genius lay, in my view, was that he had an area, an envelope on this plane where he said you didn't know what you'd find. Could be grasslands, could be shrublands, could be savannas, could be forests. And I've called this zone the climate ecosystems uncertain. This is the stage in which a whole lot of ecology plays out. And it's interesting to ask, well, how big, what is the spatial extent of this ecosystem uncertain climate zone? So we have a look at that. And here it is, mapped in the dark colors here. And it's vast. The climate stage for uncertain ecosystems is vast, enormously important in the southern continents, but also, interestingly enough, in what we would consider the temperate forest vegetation of the world. We think that these open ecosystems, the open ones, because we don't know whether these are forests or open, it's just the climate that's being picked up here. We think that the open ones cover about a third of the vegetated land surface using different criteria. So what do these places look like? I'm just going to go through a quick world tour. This is Gabon, one of my favorite mosaics of open ecosystems and close forests. And you'll see that there's no sign here of intense human activity. So this is not an obvious place for deforestation. And yet you have this extraordinary mosaic. This is high up in India, in the Western Ghats, the Shola forest and grassland mosaics. Remarkably, in that very populous country, there are very few people here. Here in Brazil, wonderful grassy landscapes, savannas and forest. In northern Australia, eucalypt savannas adjacent to closed forest, completely different species, completely different ecologies, side by side. And if we go in the northern hemisphere, this is Florida, and again a savanna, but not eucalypts, these are pines, and in the same landscape, dense closed forest, on the same soil, same climate. In Scotland, where it's bitterly cold, and you think, well, it's too miserable for tree growth, all you need to do is put a fence up, and suddenly you have a forest. So it's the same climate, and two very different vegetation types can develop. So this is puzzling. What is the role of climate here in these systems? And recently, we're very pleased to see literature coming out on the sort of analog, the Northern Hemisphere analog of Africa, which is the Eurasian forest steppes. It's a vast area, 9,000 kilometers or more from east to west, from Germany on this side, right the way through to Eastern Russia, China, Mongolia, and so on. And it's heroically, they've managed to get researchers from all these different countries to come together and to review the remarkable systems here. And you can see why they're an analog. It's also forests and grasslands. And we don't know whether the ideas we've developed in the tropics also apply here. But the grasses are all C3 grasses. They're all temperate grasses, whereas the grasses we worked on are tropical and subtropical C4 grasses. But we are now in contact with our colleagues in these parts of the world, and it'll be very interesting to follow up and see similarities and differences. So the point is that these mosaics of alternative biome states are not a rarity. They're not an oddball phenomenon. They're the norm for huge areas of the world, very large areas. And they're characterized by along a productivity gradient or along a moisture gradient in many of our parts of the world. You have the potential woody biomass if trees are able to grow to their potential, and they form a closed forest. But the actual vegetation is often much more open with very few trees. And what we have to do is to explain this extraordinary difference, just as in the fynbos example that I gave earlier. So we struggle to define these things. And the first thing to say is that they occur where closed forests can also grow. So we're not talking here about deserts, whether hot, dry deserts or cold, frosty deserts. We're talking about places that are warm enough and wet enough to grow forests. And the question is, why aren't they completely forested? Tree cover within open ecosystems varies greatly, from no trees at all to savanna woodlands. And this means that they're defined not by the density of trees, which is what's commonly used in satellite classifications of vegetation, but by the understory and whether it is intolerant of shade. Because if it's intolerant of shade, something must be stopping these shady trees from coming in and blotting out and shading out that understory. There's some process or there's some site condition that prevents the understory from being shaded out by taller trees. And we think that in many cases, in most cases, it's the lack of a canopy of trees that can shade out the understory is because of consumers of biomass, of which fire and or herbivory are vertebrate herbivory, large mammal herbivory, and in the Cretaceous, dinosaur herbivory. These were the critical characters that maintained these open ecosystems. So just to make the point clearly, this is a savanna woodland in India. And these trees you can see have charred bark because fires go through regularly. The understory is very shade intolerant, intrinsically shade intolerant C4 grasses. So it's not a dry forest, we would call this a savanna. This, in the same landscape, is a forest. There's no grass at all in the understory, and instead we have shade-tolerant herbs, forbs, and this is a forest. So if you want to define an open ecosystem, it's not by the density of trees, it's by the presence of a shade-intolerant understory, like the C4 grass. So we had to, normally the tree biomass is pretty low, but then you get Australia. And Australia, right, is always different. Here, as an example, densely wooded with eucalypts. And eucalypts are absolutely miserable to sit under for a lunchtime shade because they don't have any shade. Light pours through that canopy. So much light that if you look in the understory, you find extremely shade intolerant relatives of fambos. Here's a protea. These things can't stand shade, and there's so much light pouring through this canopy that you get a shade intolerant understory. But no one would comfortably say that this is a low biomass system. There's plenty of woody biomass here, and it's hard not to call it a forest. But if you do so, it's an open forest, not a closed one. So fire is by far the most important consumer, promoting shade-intolerant understory plants, preventing forest trees from colonizing and blotting out that shade-intolerant understory. But vertebrate consumers are also important, and they help to create and maintain some open ecosystems, like this animal here, cropping the grass and keeping it short. Herbivores love grasslands. So when grasslands first developed and spread across the planet, for the first time, animals could just put down their heads and feed and walk in a straight line for hours and hours and hours, and all the food was right there. And they were able to escape predators and produce these enormous herds of animals, whether it's antelope or deer or equids, horses, the big herd, plains animals forming vast herds of grassland creatures, not forest creatures. Grasses love herbivores, at least some grasses do, such as these ones here, which are grazing lawn grasses, being grazed flat by these white rhino. And the trees in the background are all trees that are very resistant to browsing, because this is where the animals really pack on thick. And there's not enough biomass, not enough fuel for fire. So this open ecosystem, this non-forested ecosystem, is maintained this way by heavy herbivory. The really key herbivores are not necessarily the giant animals, in my view. They are antelope, medium-sized antelope, deer, goats, sheep, wallabies. These are the things that eat forest tree seedlings and saplings and maintain an open vegetation where the climate could support a forest. So what do you have when you have an open ecosystem? Why is it open? Is it maybe it is too dry or too cold for trees? Or is it really because of consumers, fire or herbivory? Or is there something awful about the soils that's inhibiting tree growth? Sorry, I got a phone call there. I forgot to switch my phone off. So to find out whether you're dealing with a system which could be closed forests, you can look for natural mosaics, like the photo tour that I took you from. You can look to foresters. Foresters have gone and tried to plant trees in many, many places, and you can see whether it worked or not, and which trees they were able to establish. And in many places, particularly, well, everywhere throughout the world, people have established field experiments manipulating the consumers, large herbivore exclosures, or suppressing fire. And you can see whether trees increase in density and whether an open system switches to a forest. You can use correlative models, but I think they're very dangerous and very risky, and you need to refer to experiments or other data to see whether your correlations are causal. A very useful development in the past decade or two have been dynamic vegetation models, and these try and build vegetation using physiological mechanisms, physiological processes. So given a certain climate and a certain soil, and a day-to-day climate, not just the means and averages, you can see what kinds of trees ought to grow and compare it with what actually grows there. And that's quite a powerful method which we've used in South Africa and the world. So here's an example of an experiment. Here's a fence line. It's been up here for about 14 years, and there's a dramatic shift. The grasses that are here have all been displaced by tall grasses, which for some reason have died. I don't know why. And the trees have poured in here, but here it's all very open, and this is simply impala having a joel, wandering around, feeding on seedlings and saplings. Put up a fence, and the whole system changes. This is an example of it's a LiDAR image from Kruger National Park, and this looks at an exclosure created in the 1970s, and the consequence of putting up a fence which prevents elephants from getting in there and all the other herbivores. But there's no question that the profound differences that have developed over time from this state to this is because of a single animal species, the elephant. Now, creatures as big as elephants were common just 12,000 years ago, before we drove them to extinction. So who knows how different the world would have looked then. It would certainly have been a lot more open from animals such as elephants roaming through and smashing down trees. Up in the temperate zones, I've just been astonished at how important browsing is. There's not much fire here. There is fire, but it's too rare. But browsers, especially red deer, have a massive impact. You just put up a little fence like this, and the system shifts. And within it, the trees are emerging and growing up. The tree growth rates in these cold environments are slow, and it doesn't take very much browsing to prevent trees from forming a forest like this. So fascinating how influential browsing is in these temperate systems and cold systems. Fire suppression experiments have told us a great deal. This is a pine savanna, and this here is Bill Hoffman, who's been very influential in studying forest and open ecosystem boundaries, working out what's going on. And what we in here is these longleaf pine savannas were ignored for decades. And then people began to look at them in a desultory sort of way and found they were absolutely crammed with plant species. Um, they account for something like a sixth of the entire North American flora, all the species crammed in here. They're all sun-loving, and this is plants and animals. There are a whole lot suite of animals that only occur in these environments too. So fire experiments were started way back in the 1960s, and annual burns yielded this grassy, typical pine savanna. But if fire was suppressed, the whole system disappeared. Here's one pine tree as a remnant of what was, and the rest of the system has switched to a broadleaf temperate forest of sugar maple and oaks and so on, and grasses have entirely disappeared. And with them, all the richness of that open habitat forbs have gone, along with the lizards, mammals, birds, all replaced by this dreary broadleaf forest. I shouldn't make any value judgments. It's quite pretty if you don't know what it's replaced. So we've run similar experiments here in South Africa, and this is after 40 years, burnt every 2 years, whereas fire's been kept out for 40 plus years. And you'll see that tree growth is formidable where you keep fires out. The very interesting thing here is that these experiments were done right in the middle of Kruger National Park, where you have all the herbivores present, including elephants. And it shows just how powerful fire is, even in the presence of megafauna. In the higher rainfall areas, it looks like this in Kruger National Park. This has been burnt every year for the last 50 years, is a savanna, is visited by savanna animals. Savanna antelope are common here. Savanna predators are common here. Just across the road, fire has been suppressed for 50 years. If you look into it, it looks like this. The savannas have gone. There are different bird species, different mammal species, different plants. The grasses are disappearing, and the whole system is created by the climate and the soils in the absence of fire, and an entirely different system where fires burn regularly. So this is why we think consumers are of fundamental importance in maintaining open ecosystems. So we've known about the importance of fire and herbivory in controlling trees for a long time. What is new is realizing that these consumers are globally important. It's not just climate. There's a global problem here, and the consumers seem to be globally important in creating novel, open, non-forested ecosystems. The world is not a playground for trees. There were huge, and there still are, huge areas of open, non-forested systems. At a global scale, now that so many mammals went extinct 12,000 years ago or more, fire has become by far the most influential consumer, helping to maintain open habitat. So again, the dark parts here are the uncertain ecosystems where the climate favors the development of alternative biome states. And this is overlaid with an image of fire, very frequent fires, red, and yellow less frequent, and green the least frequent, or no fire at all. So just to show you again, you want to have an eye on Africa, which is where I would normally be looking, and you'll see that the fires almost exactly overlap the climates that are suitable for alternative stable states. In other words, these are savannas and grassy systems, very abundant in Africa, which accounts for just over 70% of the world's annual burnt area, because grasses burn so easily. don't worry about it, because the plants grow back so quickly that whatever carbon they release into the atmosphere, they take up again in the following year or two. The same sort of thing in South America, and the same thing in Northern Australia. And here across this Eurasian forest steppe mosaic, we see there's also a lot of fire, although these fire return intervals are less frequent than our tropical grasslands and savannas. If you could switch fire off, we think you'd have a lot more forest, and that's based on models calibrated against our long-term fire exclusion, fire suppression experiments. Just how much forest is uncertain for various reasons. Now, I can imagine that at this point people are saying, yes, but, and the problem has been for the last 100 or 200 years, fires are started by humans, and fires are agents of environmental destruction, right? So this is what humans have done to mess up the planet. And when I talk about grazing lawns with awe, because they're so phenomenally exciting, you look at them and you just say, ah, they're overgrazed, badly managed rangelands, right? Humans have fundamentally deforested Africa and other mosaic ecosystems, haven't they? And I have to admit, this is all true. All true. Fires are started by humans, and those fires can burn down forests. Grazing lawns can be created by livestock, and you can really mess up the rangelands. And there's still an open question, completely open in my view, about how much humans have actually deforested Africa or anywhere else. I think the evidence is very thin. In the tropics, it's pretty good in Europe because of historical records. So I agree, this is all true, but what if fires and the animals that open up the forests are much older than human deforestation? You're going to have to think again. So how old is the open vegetation? And what can we use as clues? So here's a short list of clues that we have explored. Is the flora and the fauna rich in species like famous or many other open systems? Are the species in those systems endemic to open habitats, or are they just merely spillovers from forest? Do the species in the open system traits, adaptations to living in open environments, and these diverge from those that live in closed environments? For example, do the trees have thick bark in a fire-prone savanna and thin bark in a forest? What is the history of the open ecosystem? I have to say, it's embarrassing how seldom people who pointing to deforestation when they look at a savanna, it's embarrassing how seldom they've looked at historical records. What do the archives say? What do diarists from explorers, what have they said? Even 100 years ago, 50 years ago. But we need to look further back. We need to look for centuries, millennia, and tens of thousands of years. And we can do so with some of the tools of quaternary paleoecology. And then the really interesting stuff, the fascinating stuff, is to explore the origins of the open habitat lineages, things that have long lived in open habitats, using phylogenies and fossils, and exploring on a scale of millions to hundreds of millions of years to look at the development, the deep geological history of these open systems. If you look at a landscape like this, this is in Shishlui Game Reserve. In the past, we would have said, well, these grasslands are created by deforestation. And basically, Iron Age farmers moved into this area around 1500 years ago, and they built weapons and built tools for which they required iron. There's iron smelting all over the place here. And this led to deforestation, producing grasslands and these open savannas. So this is the handiwork of a new cultural development in the country, Iron Age farmers. Well, we can explore this hypothesis by using paleo clues. We can look at pollen. And pollen requires swamps, and the deeper you go in those swamps, the deeper when you put a core down, it's easy to see grass pollen, to recognize it, and forest pollen can be recognized according to genus or species. The biggest problem with pollen is you need to find a wetland, you need to find a swamp in the right place to try and explore the development of grasslands versus forests over time. A wonderful new tool emerged in the 1980s, and that was carbon isotopes, where it turned out that the sun-loving grasses typical of our part of the world, in our summer rainfall areas, have completely different isotopic signal from forest trees and shade grasses, the C3 photosynthetic pathway. And when the carbon from plants falls to the soil and decomposes to make litter, that organic matter is incorporated into the soil, and the carbon isotope signal is incorporated with it. So we can look back into ancient carbon and say whether it was a grass carbon or a tree carbon. And basically, the deeper you go in the soil, the more ancient the vegetation. And the wonderful thing about this method is you don't need to look for a swamp. You can use it wherever soils are deep enough. There are problems with it. It's not nearly as sophisticated and useful in terms of species, but it does help us in determining the age of savannas versus forests. So this is the sort of thing you do. You soil pit. The surface layers here have incorporated the carbon from grasses, so they should give a grass carbon signal. And as you go deeper, you should get the carbon from the ancestral forests, which were here before people came and got rid of the forest, plowed it up, or chopped the forest down for making iron. So this is what we expect, that under forests, we're going to have forest carbon isotopes all the way down the profile. So from very young soil to much older soil. We have tested this, by the way, using carbon-14 isotopes, and the depth for age proxy does work. And under the grasslands, we expect grass carbon right at the, and then see the forest carbon deeper down. So here's our expectation, and here's what we found. Oi, oi, oi. Man, oh man. Under the forest, we get forest carbon at the top, as you'd expect. When you went deeper, we had grass carbon. Grass carbon. We went under the grassland, we didn't find any forest carbon at all. We found it was grass carbon all the way down the soil profile. We were shattered. It meant the grasslands are ancient and the forests are the new colonizers. That is, I can't put myself into the shock and horror of these findings at the time, but it was radical. An idea that was so well developed, we all believed it. But you know, you really got to test your beliefs because so often they turn out to be just prejudices that are wrong. So you find similar mosaics all over the place. Here's one that I've already shown you in the Drakensberg. This is one in Gabon, very interesting, very sharp, abrupt boundaries. Here's one in Madagascar, where this is just burnt actually, and you can see that it didn't burn the forest. It's a fantasy, a myth that the grass fires burn deep into forests. Here's another one in Kansas in North America. And so many of these transitions are now being shown to be old, ancient, with the grasslands being ancient and not new at all. So those direct tests are very satisfying, but they're hard to do on a big enough scale. So we also look at things like, as I said, is the flora rich in species, and are those species endemic? And here's a test using what are called biodiversity hotspots. Biodiversity is not evenly spread across the globe. It's very concentrated in a few areas. And if we look after those areas, we will conserve a major fraction of the world's biodiversity. Is the point of view of some people. But what it does show, here's a map of the various biodiversity hotspots of the world. And what I've done is to put arrows to all of those that are open ecosystems, not forested, which are biodiversity hotspots on a global scale. And fire is a major process in all of them. So here we have an example of very, very rich in plant species, and those plant species are endemic, restricted to those areas. So clear evidence that these are certainly not early successional. These systems are ancient. And not even all the hotspots are shown on that map because they're not hot enough. Here's just an example, a little collage of beautiful herbs from our grasslands. And there's something like 3,800 of these plant species, shade-hating, sun-loving species in South Africa's grasslands, with very high levels of endemism. If you plant trees on top of them, they'll all vanish, they all disappear. They are intrinsic to and a part of our open montane grasslands. Celebrate the grasslands. They are wonderful centers of biodiversity. At a local scale, if you look at turnover from forest to savanna, this is Shishlui data, and here the savanna has recently been colonized by dry forest in a process that we're worrying about called bush encroachment. And you see there are more species, plant species here in the savanna than there are in the forest, but significant overlap. And the overlap is almost all of savanna species that are hanging on in the shade of the forest, but have no babies at all. So they will ultimately die. Here's an example from Mexico, where the relative size shows that the forest, in this case, had more species, and the savanna fewer, but with a very small overlap of only around 5%. So if you think that forests are the only repository of biodiversity, well, you're missing out on a quarter of the biodiversity, which is lying in the savannas. So this obsession with forests and biodiversity is misplaced. The open ecosystems are crammed with species, and we need to take cognizance of that. So, yeah, these savannas are ancient, and the forests are really newcomers that have invaded these areas since, we think, the last glacial, as CO2 levels rose and the climate favored more rapid tree growth. So how old is open vegetation? The stuff that really fascinates me is when you go back millions of years. And I'd love to talk to you on that, but I don't have time. So I'm just going to summarize it. Sorry, Anusha, very briefly. The first major expansion of flowering plants was about 90 million years ago in the Cretaceous. And they suddenly started taking over and spreading rapidly from the equator to higher latitudes. But they were not forests at that time, they were shrubs. It's very, very hard to find anything that looks like an angiosperm tree until the very end of the Cretaceous. They spread as shrubs, and those shrubs burnt. They were flammable. And we know that some elements of fame moss had evolved around 90 million years ago. So you can look at Fynbos, especially up in the mountains, and think this was the first great wave of flowering plants as they began to squeeze apart and push their way in to a world dominated by earlier lineages. And that flowering plant revolution, of course, changed the world. So we think fire was definitely a part of it. And I'd love to know what's tantalizing is what was the role of dinosaurs, especially the short-necked dinosaurs. And I can't think of a way of getting at it, but yeah, anyway. The first forests are not so ancient. The first forests only evolved after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And there are various factors involved, including high CO2 and perhaps the absence of any major herbivores where the dinosaurs went, which allowed the trees to develop in the absence of major herbivory. The savanna revolution, we think in South Africa, or in Africa, started around 16 million years ago. Initially with C3 grasses, with C4 grasses pouring in and creating the fire-dependent savannas from around 7 million years ago, with their expansion largely completed by around 2 million years ago. So notice all of these is millions of years. So this phenomenon of open ecosystems has been a part of the Earth's history throughout the age of mammals, throughout the Cenozoic. And it's ridiculous to pretend that the world should be all forested. And this is what what concerns me in the last bit of this talk. Why worry about wrongly identifying open vegetation as deforested or degraded? Well, it has policy implications. The Bond Challenge. This is a plan to plant forests, one of the many, and to turn fire off. It's supported by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Can you believe it? The German government and others. The science is provided by the World Resources Institute in Washington, and the goal is to reforest 3.5 million square kilometers of degraded forests worldwide by 2030, in the next decade. There's funding, $1 billion from the World Bank spread over the next 10 years, and various other private donors to the tune of $500 million, mostly forestry companies. And in COP in Paris, $30 million was pledged there to 10 African countries for forest restoration. The incentive for developed countries is to plant trees to sequester carbon to reduce global warming. And it's also a way of trying to direct funds from rich countries to less developed countries. And of course, it's in the interest of the rich countries. It means they can continue to use fossil fuel to keep themselves warm and to run their economies a bit longer. There is a real need for forest restoration in some parts, especially in South America, where in Brazil, for example, vast areas were cleared. And it would be grand if we could restore some of those areas to forest. Then, of course, the incentive is also plantation forestry and timber products, where forestry companies are very pleased to see this interest in reforesting the world. So this is the World Resources Institute product. This is what it looks like from close up. And the more orangey colors here are where the World Resources Institute is suggesting forest restoration in savannas. So I don't know these things last had forests, in some cases, 30 million years ago. But anyway, they want to plant trees here. And many African countries are signing on to plant trees in their savannas and their grasslands. You can home in on this map and you'll get something like this in our part of the world here in the southwestern Cape. And you'll probably realize that this green stuff, which they reckon has mosaic restoration opportunities, they describe this stuff as vast amounts of deforested and degraded forest landscapes that deliver limited benefits to both humans and nature. So let's go and have a look, and yes, indeed, this is what it looks like. It's feignboss, the world's richest temperate flora, which offers no uses according to these guys. This anyway. So we try to challenge this program in a whole array of different scientific publications, but the problem is really trying to reach the public. How do you reach the public to indicate that a tree planting mania, the forest fetish, is misplaced? When I see signs like this, plant trees and save the world, I cringe. Where are they going to put them? Slap bang on top of a magnificent ancient grassland. Slap bang in a patch of feignboss, for heaven's sakes. What are they doing? The reality is you have an old growth grassland like this one in the coastal dunes, and it's going to be turned into this, a eucalypt plantation. We know how to plant eucalypts, we know how to plant pines, and the reality is that forest landscape restoration is mostly done with eucalypts and pines. And people might get fed up with them because they burn, they're fire risk, they mess up your soils, they take away the land from other uses such as crop farming or cattle. And then they leave them, chop them down, there's some old trees, and you're left with what looks vaguely like a grassland. But in that grassland are very few of the species that you had in your original pristine one. Here's some data. This is time, this is number of species. The blue dots here are forest species, just increasing linearly with time. And the yellow indicate the grasslands. And this was the pre-plantation number of species. This is what's happened. Even after 15, 20 years, the grasslands still haven't recovered the number of species. The kinds of species are completely different. The original species that were adapted to fire and adapted to this system have been replaced by weeds. It's very difficult to put Humpty Dumpty together again when that Humpty Dumpty is a pristine old growth grassland. So I think it does make sense to reforest deforested areas. And I have to say that there's some very good science going on now to identify suitable areas. I think it makes sense to plant trees in cities, like in my garden, to create pleasant public places and reduce urban hotspots. To me, it does not make sense to convert ancient open ecosystems into plantation forests and call it forest landscape restoration. Dig deeper into it and ask what is really the motivation. These areas have not been forests for hundreds of thousands of years. And in general, biologically sequestering carbon is slow and uncertain. Those eucalypt plantations could burn down, as happened in Portugal. Those pine plantations could burn down, as has happened all over the place. And then whatever carbon you sequester is gone. We are in deep trouble. And I think that the first things we need to do is reduce emissions. Stop using coal, reduce oil use. And in Africa, which is on the edge of massive urbanization, urbanize with renewable or nuclear energy and avoid coal and fossil fuels to reduce the problems of global warming. So when you support a tree planting project, what I would ask you to do is to stop, think, are those trees restoring a forest, or are they being planted by people who are not aware that they could be planting in an ancient open ecosystem? Ask the question, what might be lost by planting those trees? And you can use this mantra, let us plant the right trees in the right place for the right reasons. Thank you very much. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, William. You've given us so much to think about. My goodness. And I'm sure nobody else realized that we even went over time, so it doesn't matter. Everybody's been spellbound listening to you, and I think it's just been absolutely fascinating. I won't hog the stage now that I have the microphone. I'm rather going to give it to the floor and ask people if they have any questions. Can you please raise your hand, turn on your microphone, and you can turn on your audio as well when you ask the question.
My apologies for going over time.
But it was engrossing, so I don't think people minded. Are there any questions? Oh, there's a hand. Yes, Serban.
Hi, William. Very, very thought stimulating. Just wanted you to comment on how the climate, how do you match past climate in a presumably more open world with this view that the way to reduce global warming is not necessarily reforestation?
I'm not sure if I understand it, but are you saying how do we reduce the carbon that we've already released into the atmosphere?
No. Let's look at past climates. So, can you actually see an impact of having had a more open ecosystems in the past? Can you actually point that out in the past climates, in the climate record? Can you see how that impacted the climate, having had more open ecosystems in the past?
No, I think that's a very interesting question, and I don't know of good work looking at it, but you know, what are the feedbacks of changing vegetation cover? We know broadly what they are. We know that in some latitudes, like in the boreal region, if you plant up trees, it creates a darker albedo, and the trees would absorb more sunlight and reflect less. So the net effect of having trees rather than open, low vegetation would be to warm the planet rather than cool it. The knowledge beyond there is quite weak. And I think what I'd really like to see is some Earth system scientists, some good climatology, exploring these questions of what are the consequences of major changes in land cover. So thanks. I think it's a very important question, and I have to say that if I was going to start all over again, I'd want to be a planetary ecologist, able to answer questions like yours.
Thanks. I see there's a response in the chat from Guy Midgley. I don't know if would you like to read it, Anusha?
Let me see.
I thought, William, maybe a higher albedo of grasslands as they expanded under lower CO2 would be, it's a bit like ice expanding as the world cooled and reinforcing the cooling trend. That might be something interesting. And then, of course, grasses are pretty good at producing deep drainage high in carbon, possibly. That also accelerates the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. C4 grasses are pretty good at trying to drag CO2 down below the compensation point for trees. So I think trees came pretty close to getting nailed by C4 grasses.
Okay. All right. Thank you both.
Yeah, fascinating.
Well, I hope it just wasn't my side only, but I lost you a little bit, Guy. But maybe everyone else was okay. Were you okay, William? Did you manage to get everything there?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We have a question from Neil Braithwaite. Neil, you want to ask a question? You have to turn on your microphone.
Unmute. Yes, thank you. I only came in towards the end of your talk, but I was very grateful to get that bit of it. And I presume you'll send us a link or whatever. We can look on YouTube at a later stage. What I wanted to know is, I've been very interested in trees for some time, but I'm very poor at identifying them. But I can identify some of the forest trees in our beautiful forest here on Table Mountain. And I know that the Afro-montane forest stretches right the way up the country. And it occurs at different levels as you go further up towards the equator. Now, my question is, how much Afro-montane forest have we lost? And how much can we put it back? And is that a good idea?
So very little. We've lost very little. I read the numbers. I read the numbers in a paper in South Africa Science recently, I think, and it was surprisingly small. The estimates of what we've lost. This is since European settlement. So I would say what's intriguing with our forests is that they're so diverse, and yet they're so small. They are minute. So I would suggest that the forest cover, when we really had a lot of forest, we probably going back, I don't know, 12, 15, 20 million years. And what we've seen is the consequence of the spread of grasses from around 15 million years ago, from the mid-Miocene. So the forests are remnants of what was once widespread, but it's been over millions of years and not over significant periods of human history.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So in other words, that it reinforces your idea that we should be protecting the grasslands rather than the forests.
No, I think protect both. Protect both. But the forests are magnificent, and their diversity is astonishing, given that they cover such a small area. But that certainly doesn't mean that we should then stop burning grasslands, for example, which is what I used to work for forestry, and they wanted to protect the forest by putting big fire breaks around it. Well, those forests have sat there for tens of thousands of years with fire licking at their base without being burnt, or now and again being burnt, but then regrowing and moving out again. So we've got to accept that these things have been facing each other for a very long time. And let's celebrate both of them. It's absolutely wonderful to have the sun on your back on a cool day and to get a bit of shade on a hot one.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much, William.
So, William, there's a question on the chat from Sharon Bosma, who asks, what about the role of trees in the hydrological cycle affecting climate?
Yeah. Well, South Africa has the longest running hydrology experiments in the world testing the impact of trees on stream flow. That's at Jonkershoek, 1938, and it's still going. And those studies clearly showed that forests reduce stream flow. the remaining question is whether trees change the climate, make it more humid. So basically the idea is that trees are supposed to take up more water and evapotranspire more, and this produces more humidity in the air, and so water gets recycled more often in a forested landscape than a grassland landscape, and this increases the rainfall. So that idea has been around for something like 200 years, and I don't see any evidence for it. Dave LeMaitre has pointed out that, at least in our part of the world, the steep altitudinal gradients means that rainfall is largely controlled by orographic effects, and recycling of rain through vegetation would not make much difference. But I know it's a popular idea, and what I would suggest is that if you can think of any way of testing it, any way, other than from models. So the models you can play around with, and they provide some support. But if there's any empirical support, let's hear about it. We've planted huge areas under pines in places like in Mpumalanga and so on. And what difference have they made, if any, to rainfall? We should be looking at that. We're in a uniquely well-suited situation to see whether planting trees changes rainfall. We already know very well that planting trees dries up rivers. So, yeah, it's an open question. But in the South African context, I would say that all the evidence points to, if you plant trees, you're going to have less water to distribute to cities, to towns, to people, to farms downstream.
There's a question. Does anyone want to ask a question? Because there are several questions coming up in the chat, but if you want to ask your question, you're welcome to turn on your microphone and ask it.
No. Hello, it's Heidi here. I can't see how to put my hand up, sorry.
That's fine.
I had a question, maybe one which none of us here can answer, but so William, if I look at the global targets for the forest and landscape restoration, they clearly say they're not only about trees. And in each case, it is to revitalize landscapes so that we can meet the needs of people and the environment sustainably, etc. And from what I can see, it's only the AFR 100 that has chosen, to make it all about trees. So in the AFR 100, they say there's two activities: planting trees in agricultural landscapes or in so-called degraded areas, which, as you've pointed out, are not. So I'm just wondering if there isn't a big, opportunity here, because the forest and landscape restoration in their policy say it's not all about trees. It's just our local African one that has made it really about that.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. In fact, I wanted to get hold of you, so it's very good to see you. The reality is, if you look at the proposals under the ones that I've seen, at any rate, it's tree planting, and it's putting fires out. Fires are dreadful, so you mustn't burn, which trashes things, and you mustn't have any livestock around because they'll eat the trees. So no more livestock, which in Africa is a travesty when people are so dependent and interwound with cattle, and fires are part of the system. So I think what we need to do, and this is why I wanted to contact you, is to do we have enough science to say that, look, we can restore grasslands and we can rebuild organic matter in grasslands, and that this, unlike trees, is perfectly well suited to frequent fires rolling across them. But at the same time, we can accumulate larger quantities of carbon by managing grasslands in a particular way. If we could do that, then we have an additional reason, along with using grasslands for water catchments and the other use that we have for it. So I just feel uneasy that we don't have enough information on land management and carbon gain in our grassy systems. But I'd love to be able to say we do. And then this is the right time to put forward proposals for carbon sequestration by restoring grassy systems and not planting trees where they never were.
Right.
And certainly some of our grasslands are really badly mangled. You know, some of the Drakensberg grasslands in communal areas have been shaved clean. There's just bare soil there now. So how much could we recuperate or restore? Anyway, let's do it.
Yeah,
We have
there
a
are a
question
few
from,
projects, but I think the
Dimitri.
science, sorry. I think the science is depending a lot on models at the moment, but there are a few projects.
Great.
Thanks, Heidi. Guy, you want to ask your question, please?
Yes, William. Great talk as always. You made a few things you said. Maybe look at it problem in a different way now, and I want to ask you this question to do with eucalyptus. What's the point of being a tall tree if you're not going to cast shade? That seems quite an interesting. Yeah. So yeah. What's going on with eucalyptus? Why don't they cast shade?
No, it's very interesting, and it's to avoid the flames. The tallest eucalypts, which are the tallest angiosperms in the world, have wattle trees that burn underneath them, and it's remarkable how the height of eucalypts, to me, seems proportional to the height of the flames and the vegetation underneath them. And they're smaller in savannas because the flames aren't as high when grasses burn. So when the savannas are colonized by African grasses, like gamba grass, Andropogon gayanus, that grass is more than 2 meters tall, and its flames burn out eucalypt canopies completely and destroy the eucalypts. So I think that the eucalypts are a fascinating sort of giant savanna tree. That's a hypothesis.
But why don't they play the shade game then? If they've got that available to them, why not just get rid of the flammable understory?
I think to grow as fast, Guy, I think we're doing a bit of a sideways walk here, but eucalypts are among the fastest growing trees on the planet. And they do it by dropping lots of leaves. The more leaves you have, the more self-shading you have, and the slower you grow. But the better able you are to defend canopy space. So I'm just astonished that eucalypts grow so incredibly fast. But I think they do it by dropping their leaves. Anyway, we can talk about it one day.
Okay, I think we have to stop, people. It's already 6:25, and so we're way over time. And we've kept William already online for more than an hour and a half, actually. So I think we definitely need to stop. But I'm sure, William, if people have any burning questions, they can email you. And, well, can I give your email address, William?
Yes, surely.
Okay,
And
so
I'd just like to say, I'd like to greet so many familiar names like Swazig. Very nice to see you. Not sure where you are. Francis Siebert and Kath Bunny and Ben Wigley and Darwood. It's just such a treat to see people, even if it's through blooming digital space, So greetings, everyone. It's been great to have you along. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Thank you. Thank you very much, people. So, yeah, you can find William's email. It's very simple. It's william.bond@uct.ac.za. So if you want to ask any questions, you're welcome to send an email. But thank you very much, William. It was fabulous, and we look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Thank you.
Great.